Phew, I'm tired. Finally, this show is over. The words sliced through the quiet, shattering the fragile dream I had been living in just hours ago. The scent of roses and candle wax still clung to the air, remnants of the grand ceremony that had just taken place. The wedding dress, my wedding dress, lay discarded in a heap on the chair, its once pristine lace now wrinkled and forgotten. The golden glow of the bedside lamp flickered slightly, casting shifting shadows across the luxurious hotel suite. I turned my head slowly, my breath caught somewhere between my lungs and throat. He stood by the window, his back partially turned to me, fingers unfastening the cufflinks of his crisp white shirt. There was something unsettlingly casual in his posture, in the way he exhaled as if shedding a heavy burden. "What did you say?" My voice came out weaker than I intended, trembling, barely louder than the soft rustle of the silk sheets beneath me. He didn't turn around immediately. Instead, he chuckled, shaking his head slightly before finally meeting my gaze. His expression wasn't one of exhaustion or relief. It was indifference. Cold, absolute indifference. "I said," he repeated, his voice smooth, detached. "I'm tired. This whole act, this show, I'm just glad it's finally over." The air between us grew unbearably thick, pressing against my ribs, making it hard to breathe. I sat up slowly, gripping the sheets as if they were the only thing tethering me to reality. But this wasn't an act. My voice cracked. We just got married. A dry smirk pulled at the corner of his lips. He unbuttoned the top of his shirt, running a hand through his tousled dark hair before sighing, as if my words were an inconvenience to him. "Come on," he said, almost amused. "You didn't actually believe all that, did you?" My stomach twisted. "You told me you loved me," I whispered, barely able to form the words. My hands clenched into fists on my lap, nails digging into my palms. "You looked into my eyes, I told you what you wanted to hear," he interrupted smoothly, shrugging. What else was I supposed to do? Ruin the mood before the wedding? I felt as if I'd been doused in ice water. My lips parted, but no sound came out. "I don't understand," I finally managed to say. My throat felt raw. "You really should have seen this coming," he continued, taking off his watch and placing it on the nightstand with a quiet clink. "It was never about love. It was a deal, a business move. That's all this ever was." I felt the world tilt beneath me. A deal, a business move. The words rang in my head like an unbearable, discordant melody. "You're lying." My voice barely carried across the room. "This is a sick joke. It has to be." He laughed, actually laughed, as if I had just said something ridiculous. "Believe what you want." He stretched his arms, rolling his shoulders as if relieving tension. "But there's no need to keep pretending now. The papers are signed. The deal is done. So let's drop the act, shall we?" The walls of the hotel suite seemed to close in on me, the dim light now suffocating rather than comforting. The city skyline beyond the window was a blur of neon lights and moving cars, an indifferent world that didn't care that mine had just crumbled into dust. My fingers reached for the wedding ring on my left hand, twisting it frantically as if I could somehow loosen the nightmare gripping me. You can't be serious," I whispered. "Then why did you marry me? Why go through with all of this if you never—" "Because it was convenient," he said simply. "Because it was necessary. And now that we're married, there's no point in pretending anymore." I felt something inside me crack. "And what happens now?" My voice was barely above a whisper. He shrugged, unconcerned. "Nothing changes. You stay by my side. You smile when you're supposed to, and you don't cause problems." I blinked rapidly, my vision blurring with unshed tears. "And if I refuse?" His expression darkened just slightly, enough for a chill to race down my spine. "You won't," he said calmly. The certainty in his tone made me feel sick. "You think you can control me?" I choked out. "You think I'll just accept this?" His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I don't need to control you," he said, voice smooth as silk. "You won't leave, you won't fight back, and you certainly won't divorce me." My breath hitched. "You can't force me to stay," I managed, though my voice betrayed the tremble of fear creeping into my bones. "Can't I?" He took a slow step closer, just enough for me to feel the weight of his presence. "You don't really want to know what would happen if you tried." A shiver ran through me. My body felt frozen in place, my mind racing for an escape, for a way to make sense of this nightmare. And then, as if the conversation had been nothing more than an insignificant formality, he grabbed his phone from the nightstand, checked the time, and turned toward the door. "You should get some rest," he said, his tone light, almost absent. And then he walked out. The door clicked shut behind him. Silence. An unbearable, suffocating silence. I sat there, unmoving, the sound of my own heartbeat thudding painfully in my ears. The night outside continued as if nothing had happened. The world carried on. But I was trapped in the ruins of a love that had never been real. A sharp sob broke past my lips. I collapsed onto the bed, clutching at the sheets that still smelled like wedding flowers and dreams that had turned to dust. And for the first time in my life, I truly understood what it felt like to be alone. I always thought I was the kind of woman who couldn't be fooled. I had seen too much, heard too much, lived too much to fall for empty words and well-rehearsed charm. When you grow up in wealth, when your world is filled with lavish parties, whispered deals, and carefully calculated relationships, you learn quickly that love is often just another currency. I had watched friends fall for the wrong men, gold diggers, frauds, men who saw them as nothing more than stepping stones to power. I had seen their hearts broken, their lives unraveled, and I swore I would never be like them. I would never be fooled. And for a long time, I wasn't. I was careful, selective. My standards were high, impossibly high, because they had to be. I didn't entertain men who tried too hard, who flattered too easily, who spoke in carefully crafted lines designed to sweep women off their feet. I could see through all of it. I had to. And then I met him. It was at a gala, one of those grand, glittering events where everyone was someone, where power hummed through the air like electricity. I wasn't interested in the people there. I had attended out of obligation, wearing my most disinterested expression as I moved through the crowd, dodging small talk and empty compliments. And then, just as I was about to leave, I felt a presence beside me. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else." I turned, half expecting another boring businessman trying to impress me. But the moment our eyes met, something shifted. He wasn't like the others. There was no over-eagerness in his expression, no forced charm. He looked amused, intrigued even, but there was a quiet confidence about him, a presence that demanded attention without asking for it. I raised an eyebrow. "What gave it away?" "The way you've been checking the time every 5 minutes." He smirked, lifting his glass to his lips. "You have somewhere better to be?" I should have brushed him off. I should have walked away. But there was something about him, something different. And that was how it started. It wasn't fast. It wasn't an overwhelming, head-over-heels whirlwind of romance. No, he was too patient for that. He didn't flood me with gifts or over-the-top gestures. He didn't rush. Instead, he let the tension build, let the intrigue simmer just enough to keep me coming back. He was charming, but not in the way most men were. He didn't try too hard, didn't chase me like the others did. He made me feel like I was the one who wanted to chase him. And I did. Slowly, against all my better judgment, I let my guard down. He was different. He was powerful, like me. Wealthy, like me. He understood the world I lived in, the expectations, the pressures, the way people used each other. And because he understood, I thought, foolishly, naively, that he wouldn't be like them. I tested him. Again and again, I watched. I waited for the moment he would slip, the moment he would reveal that he was just like the rest, but it never came. Instead, he showed me a world I had never known. Late-night conversations over whiskey and dim city lights, secret getaways to places no one knew about, long drives with no destination, just music, just us. He wasn't just attentive, he was thoughtful. He knew when I needed space, when I needed silence, when I needed someone to remind me that I wasn't just a name, a legacy, an heir to an empire. With him, I felt seen. And before I knew it, I was falling. falling in a way I had never allowed myself to before. I told myself it was safe. He didn't need my money. He didn't need my connections. He had everything I had, maybe more. He couldn't possibly have any ulterior motives. And so, for the first time in my life, I let go of my fears. For the first time, I let myself love. There were nights I would wake up and just watch him. The way the soft glow of the city lights framed his face, the way his chest rose and fell in the quiet rhythm of sleep. And I would wonder, how did I get this lucky? How did I find the one person I could trust in a world full of masks and deception? I told him everything, my fears, my insecurities, the things I had never admitted to anyone. And he listened, always listened. He made me believe. He made me believe in love. And so, when he proposed, I didn't hesitate. It wasn't about the ring, though it was beautiful. It wasn't about the grand gesture, though it was perfect. It was about him. It was about the way he looked at me, the way he made me feel like I was the only person in the world. It was about the way, for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid. I should have been. Looking back, I wonder if there were signs. Small things I ignored, moments that didn't quite fit, words that lingered just a little too long in my mind. But I was too in love, too blinded by the fairy tale I had built in my head to see the cracks forming beneath the surface. I told myself I was safe. I told myself he was different. And so, on our wedding night, as I stood in that hotel suite, still glowing from the joy of the day, I had no idea that the man I had trusted more than anyone would soon shatter me in ways I never thought possible. No idea that, in just a few hours, he would look at me with those same eyes, the ones I had fallen in love with, and tell me that none of it was real, that it had never been real. I never saw it coming. Even now, looking back, trying to piece together the moments that should have warned me, I struggle to understand how I missed it. How could I have been so blind? I suppose love does that to people. It wraps around you like silk, soft and comforting, until one day you realize it's a noose. I had no reason to doubt him, or at least that's what I told myself every time something didn't quite fit. At first, they were small things that, on their own, didn't mean anything. Like the way his phone was always on silent when we were together, the way he would step out of the room to take certain calls, the way his expression would shift ever so slightly before he answered a question, like he was carefully choosing his words. I noticed. Of course I did. But I never questioned it. Why would I? He was a powerful man, constantly surrounded by people who wanted something from him. I knew what that was like. I understood. I told myself it was normal, that I was overthinking, that I was just being paranoid. But there were moments, brief, fleeting moments, where something in my gut whispered that something was wrong. Like the night we attended a charity gala together, and I caught a woman staring at him from across the room. Not just staring, watching. There was something in her eyes, something unreadable, something that sent a strange chill down my spine. I turned to him, ready to ask if he knew her. But the moment he noticed my gaze, he leaned in, brushed his lips against my temple, and whispered, "You look beautiful tonight." And just like that, I forgot about the woman. Or at least, I forced myself to. Then there was the time I overheard him on the phone late at night. His voice was low, controlled, but there was an edge to it, something sharp, something that didn't quite sound like him. I had woken up to the sound of his voice, barely awake, the warmth of the sheets cocooning me as I listened. "It's handled. There's nothing to worry about." A pause, a sigh. I said I'll take care of it. I remember lying there, my heart picking up speed for reasons I couldn't explain. When he came back to bed, I turned to face him. Who was that? He didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. Work. He slipped an arm around me, pulling me close, his lips brushing against my forehead. Go back to sleep. And I did. Because I wanted to believe him. Because I loved him. Because the idea that there could be something hidden beneath the perfect life we had built was too terrifying to consider. But the cracks were there, whether I wanted to see them or not. Like the way he would sometimes look at me, not with love, not with admiration, but with something else. A quiet calculation, as if he were studying me. Or the way he always knew exactly what to say, exactly how to calm my fears, exactly how to redirect my thoughts whenever I started asking too many questions. I told myself I was lucky, that I had found the perfect man, that I had nothing to fear. But then there was the envelope. It arrived on a Wednesday morning, slipped under the door of my apartment before we were married. A plain white envelope, no name, no return address. Inside was a single photograph, a picture of him, with another woman. They weren't touching. They weren't even looking at each other. But the way they stood, close, too close, sent an uncomfortable feeling crawling up my spine. My hands trembled as I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And then, just as quickly as the doubt crept in, I shoved it away. There was no proof, no context. It could have been anyone, a business associate, a friend, a stranger who just happened to be standing too close when the picture was taken. When I showed him the photo, he barely even looked at it before chuckling. "Really?" His lips curled into a smirk, amusement dancing in his eyes. "You think this means something?" I swallowed. I don't know who sent it." "Someone trying to cause trouble," he said easily, reaching for the envelope and tossing it onto the table without a second glance. "People love to meddle in things they don't understand." He stepped closer, tilting my chin up so I had no choice but to meet his gaze. "You trust me, don't you?" I did. God, I did. So I let it go. I convinced myself it was nothing, that I was being foolish, that I was letting fear get the best of me. I buried the doubts, the questions, the unease. Because at the end of the day, he was still the man who kissed me softly in the mornings, who held my hand under the dinner table, who whispered in my ear when we danced, making me laugh even when I didn't want to. He was still the man who made me feel like the center of the universe. So I ignored the way my stomach twisted when his phone rang and he excused himself. I ignored the way his answers were always just vague enough to leave room for doubt. I ignored the tiny voice in my head that whispered, "What if?" Because love is a funny thing. It makes you see what you want to see, believe what you want to believe. And even though the cracks were there, even though the warnings had been whispered to me in 100 little ways, I never once considered that one day he would stand before me, look me in the eyes, and tell me that none of it was real, that I had been living a lie. The silence in the room was unbearable. Just hours ago, it had been filled with laughter, music, the clinking of champagne glasses. The air had been warm with the scent of roses, vanilla candles, expensive perfume. The walls still held the echoes of whispered congratulations, of toasts made in our honor. Now, it was just me. Alone. I sat in the middle of the grand hotel suite, the very room meant for the first night of our new life together. The dim glow of the chandelier reflected off the countless gold-rimmed decorations, casting soft, romantic shadows. Shadows that now felt like cruel reminders of what had just happened. I was still in my wedding dress. The silk fabric clung to me, wrinkled, stained with tears. The intricate embroidery, the delicate pearls along the sleeves, each detail that had once made me feel like the most beautiful woman in the world now felt suffocating. The veil had long since slipped from my hair, pooling on the floor beside me, forgotten like the illusion of love I had believed in. My fingers trembled as they reached for the bottle of champagne sitting on the table. An expensive vintage, a gift meant for celebration. Well, no point letting it go to waste. I pulled the cork free with an unsteady hand, the soft pop echoing through the empty room. The golden liquid poured into a crystal flute, bubbles rising to the surface like mocking little reminders of what tonight was supposed to be. I stared at the glass for a long moment. Then I drank. The first sip burned in my throat. The second went down smoother. By the third, the numbness started to creep in, dulling the sharp edges of my thoughts, blurring the weight of his words still ringing in my ears. It was never about love. I laughed. A broken, bitter sound. "Guess I should have seen that coming, huh?" I muttered to no one. The room didn't answer. I reached for the bottle again. Drink after drink, the night blurred around me. The golden glow of the room softened, the sharp ache in my chest dulled. I barely felt the pins slipping from my hair, barely noticed the way the skirt of my dress pooled around me as I sank further onto the plush carpet. At some point, my fingers found my phone. I stared at the screen, my vision hazy, the numbers swimming before my eyes. My heart ached, my hands shook, but before I could stop myself, I dialed. The call rang once, twice. A pause. Then, "Hello?" I sucked in a shaky breath, gripping the phone tighter. My voice came out thick, slurred. "Hey!" A beat of silence. Then, a careful, measured response. "Are you okay?" I laughed, the sound hollow. "No, not even close." Another pause. The voice on the other end didn't rush me, didn't push, just waited. My throat tightened, the words catching before I could form them. My free hand curled into the fabric of my dress, as if grounding myself. "I think I made a mistake." A sigh. Deep. Quiet. "Tell me what happened." I took another shaky sip from the champagne flute, barely registering the taste anymore. "It was all a lie," I whispered. "Every single thing. He never loved me." My voice cracked on the last word, and I hated how small it made me sound. Silence again. Then, "Where are you?" I looked around the lavish room, the untouched bed, the scattered remnants of a perfect wedding night that never was. My head swayed slightly, the alcohol making it hard to focus. "Still here," I murmured. "In the suite." "You're alone?" I frowned, my mind sluggish. "Of course." The voice on the other end exhaled sharply. "You need to leave." I blinked. "Why?" "You just do." Something about the urgency in their voice sent a shiver down my spine. I opened my mouth to ask more, but my vision swam, the alcohol pulling me deeper, making my limbs heavy. "I don't think I can," I admitted softly, my head tipping back against the couch. "I'm so tired." A curse. Low, frustrated. Then, "Stay on the line with me, okay?" I smiled, though it was a sad, drunken thing. "You're always so serious." No response, just steady, patient breathing. I let my eyes drift closed. The champagne flute slipped from my fingers, landing somewhere on the carpet with a soft thud. "I thought he was different," I whispered. "I really, really thought he was different." "I know." The voice was softer now, almost gentle. "Just hold on, all right?" But I didn't. The weight of the night, the exhaustion, the heartbreak, the alcohol, it all pulled me under. And before I could say anything else, before I could hear the last words spoken on the other end of the line, darkness. A sharp knock at the door jolted me awake. Pain exploded behind my eyes, a pounding rhythm that made my stomach churn. My mouth was dry, my limbs heavy, and for a moment, I had no idea where I was. Then it all came rushing back. The wedding, his words, the drinking, the call. I groaned, burying my face into the pillows. My head felt like it had been cracked open, my skin sticky with dried tears and traces of champagne. The remnants of my dress lay crumpled on the floor, the room still carrying the heavy scent of roses and regret. Another knock. Firmer this time. "Pani Nasalnitsia, it's me. Please open the door." I froze. I knew that voice, Jamie. My secretary, my right hand in all things. The man who had handled my affairs with unwavering precision for years. Reliable, intelligent, composed. Everything I wasn't at this moment. God. A fresh wave of embarrassment crashed over me. I had called him. I had told him everything. Slowly, with effort, I dragged myself out of bed. Every muscle in my body protested, my head throbbing with the cruel weight of last night's decisions. I found my robe draped over the chair, pulling it on with trembling hands, tying the sash tightly around my waist as if that could somehow hold me together. Another knock. "Madam?" I took a deep breath, wincing at the dull ache in my skull. Then, finally, I forced myself to shuffle toward the door. I hesitated for just a moment before unlocking it and pulling it open. Jamie stood there, crisp as always in a tailored navy suit, his dark hair neatly combed, his eyes sharp and assessing. But the moment he saw me, something in his expression softened. I must have looked awful. Swollen eyes, tangled hair, the remnants of ruined makeup still smudged across my skin. "Jamie," I croaked, my voice raw from crying. He stepped inside without hesitation, closing the door behind him. "You look terrible," he said flatly, but there was no malice in it. I let out a weak, humorless laugh. "Thanks." "You should drink some water," he said, already moving toward the minibar. "And take something for your head. You sound like death." "Feel like it too," I muttered, rubbing my temples. Jamie grabbed a bottle of water, twisted the cap off, and handed it to me. I took a sip, wincing as the cold liquid hit my dry throat. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I could feel his gaze on me, assessing, calculating, waiting. I didn't want to look at him, didn't want to see the judgment I was sure was there. But then he sighed, folding his arms. "So, you remember what you told me last night?" I swallowed hard. "Not all of it." He exhaled through his nose, running a hand through his hair. "You called me at 3 a.m, drunk, crying." His voice softened just slightly. "You told me everything." I clenched the bottle in my hands, shame burning through me. Jamie had seen me in every state, angry, frustrated, exhausted, but never like this, never broken. I turned away, staring at the untouched bed. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." His voice was firm. "But you need to understand something." I risked a glance at him. He wasn't angry. He wasn't judging. He was just serious. "You can't let this go," he said. "Not like this." My chest tightened. "Jamie? No." He cut me off. "I know you. I know how you think. You're humiliated, you're hurt, and right now, you just want to disappear." He wasn't wrong. He took a step closer, his voice lowering. "But if you do that, he wins. He gets away with it." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "What am I supposed to do? My voice wavered. "He planned this, every part of it, and I—" My breath hitched. I walked right into it. Jamie's jaw tightened. "Then we do something about it." I shook my head, frustration and exhaustion warring inside me. "He made it clear I can't fight this." Jamie let out a slow, controlled breath. "That's what he wants you to think." I stared at him, my hands gripping the robe tighter. I don't even know where to start. "Then let me help you." His gaze was steady, unwavering. "You don't have to do this alone." I let out a bitter laugh. "You signed up to be my secretary, Jamie, not my— whatever this is." He didn't smile. "I signed up to work for you because I believed in you, and I still do." The weight of his words settled deep in my chest. For so long, I had relied on my own strength. I had built walls, fought my own battles, never allowed anyone to see me vulnerable. But now I was exposed. And yet, Jamie was still here. I exhaled shakily, my fingers loosening their grip. "I don't know if I can do this." "You can," he said simply, "and you will." I searched his face for any hint of uncertainty, any sign that he was just saying what I wanted to hear. But there was none, just quiet, unwavering resolve. And for the first time since last night, I felt something other than despair. A spark, small, barely there, but burning. I had spent my entire life making the right choices, calculating every move, ensuring that no one could ever use me, trick me, betray me. And yet, here I was, a wife in a marriage that was never real, a fool who had walked straight into the most humiliating deception of her life. I sat on the balcony of my penthouse, wrapped in a thick robe, staring at the skyline stretching endlessly before me. The city was alive beneath me, cars moving, lights flickering, people going about their lives, oblivious to the chaos that had consumed mine. Days had passed since that night, since Jamie showed up at my door. I hadn't contacted him since, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know what I wanted to say. I had spent these last few days in silence, trying to think, trying to breathe. But no matter how many scenarios I played in my head, the answer was always the same. I couldn't let this go. And yet, the solution wasn't so simple. If I left him, if I filed for divorce, what would happen? Would he fight it? Would he make my life even worse than he already had? Would he try to destroy me in ways I hadn't even imagined yet? The man I married wasn't just a liar. He was calculating. He had orchestrated every part of this marriage with precision. He knew exactly what he was doing, and I had no doubt that whatever move I made next, he had already thought about it first. The logical part of me whispered that walking away was the safest choice. Take the humiliation, take the heartbreak, cut my losses, and disappear from his world before he could sink his claws any deeper. But the fire inside me burned hotter every time I thought about his words that night. You won't leave me. You won't fight back. You'll accept this arrangement as it is. No, I wouldn't. I had spent my entire life fighting to be untouchable. And now, when it mattered most, I couldn't let him take that from me. But then there was Jamie. Jamie, who had stood in my hotel suite that morning, telling me I could fight this, that I should fight this, that I wasn't alone. I clenched my hands into fists, my nails digging into my palms. I wanted to trust him. I needed to trust someone, but he was still a man. And men, they could betray you. They could lie, manipulate, twist words into promises they never intended to keep. Hadn't I already learned that lesson? Hadn't I just seen how easily a man could look me in the eyes and make me believe in something that was never real? The thought made my stomach turn. If I let Jamie help me, if I put my trust in him, what if he was just another version of the man I had married? What if this was just another game? The doubt gnawed at me, and for a moment, I almost convinced myself to do this alone. But then I thought about the years I had known him. Jamie had worked for me since the beginning. He had been with me through every deal, every crisis, every high and low. He knew how I operated, understood the weight of my name, the power of my position. And he had never failed me. Not once. Not in all the years we had worked together. And wasn't that worth something? I sighed, rubbing my temples as another headache threatened to settle in. I wasn't naive anymore. I knew that trust wasn't something given freely. It was something earned. And Jamie had earned it. So I made my decision. I reached for my phone, staring at his name in my contacts for what felt like forever before finally typing out a message. We need to talk. Let's meet in 2 days. I hesitated. Then, before I could change my mind, I hit send. It was time to fight back. The moment I sent that message to Jamie, there was no turning back. 2 days later, we met in my office, neutral ground, where emotions couldn't cloud judgment, where I could pretend I was nothing more than the businesswoman I had always been. Jamie sat across from me, his usual sharp, controlled demeanor in place, but his eyes, those dark, observant eyes, were softer than I'd ever seen them. So, he said, leaning forward slightly, where do we start? I exhaled slowly, my fingers tapping lightly against the glass of water on my desk. We do this carefully, quietly. I don't want him knowing anything until we're ready to strike. Jamie nodded. That's what I was thinking too. If we move too fast or too publicly, he'll get defensive. And the last thing we need is him making this harder than it already is. Harder. It was already impossible. Untangling myself from him, from this web of deception, wouldn't just be about signing papers. This was a war, a battle for control, and I refused to lose. Jamie laid out the plan, his voice calm, methodical, reassuring. He had already started researching my legal options, potential loopholes in our prenup, ways to use his deception against him. I watched him as he spoke, my mind drifting slightly. Jamie had always been good at his job. No, excellent. He was efficient, precise, never wasting words or time. But now, I was seeing him in a different light. For years, I had thought of him as nothing more than my secretary, my assistant, my problem solver, my voice of reason when emotions threatened to cloud my judgment. But sitting here, listening to him speak, watching the quiet determination in his expression, I realized something. Jamie believed in me. He wasn't just here because it was his job. He was here because he wanted to be, because he wanted to help me. And that was something I wasn't used to. The days that followed were consumed by strategy. We met in secret, late at night in my office, in quiet corners of high-end restaurants where no one would think twice about seeing me with my assistant. We sifted through contracts, collected evidence, built our case piece by piece. And through it all, my husband remained blissfully unaware. He hadn't asked where I was, hadn't questioned my absence at home, hadn't even bothered to pretend to be the loving husband he had once played so convincingly. And that, more than anything, made my decision feel even more justified. He had never wanted a wife. He had wanted an asset, and he had chosen the wrong woman to manipulate. But amidst all the planning, something strange was happening. Jamie was changing. Or rather, I was changing in how I saw him. At work, he had always been so composed, so polished, so strictly professional that I had never thought to look deeper. But now that we were spending so much time together, I was seeing parts of him I had never noticed before. The way his lips curled into a subtle smirk when he found something amusing. The way his shoulders relaxed when he let his guard down. The way his voice softened when he spoke to me, not as his boss, but as someone he cared about. And most of all, the way he made me laugh. I hadn't laughed in weeks, maybe even months, but Jamie had this way of cutting through the tension with dry, sarcastic remarks that made me snort in the middle of serious discussions, his deadpan delivery making it impossible not to smile. "You know," he said one evening, flipping through some documents at my dining table, "for someone who always preaches control, you really picked the worst possible man to marry." I shot him a glare over my wine glass. "Thanks, Jamie. That's exactly what I needed to hear." He smirked. "Just saying. You could have picked someone slightly less psychopathic." "Well," I huffed, leaning back in my chair, "I didn't see a line of eligible bachelors forming at my doorstep." Jamie hummed thoughtfully, tapping his pen against the table. "I'm sure there were plenty." I raised an eyebrow. "What are you implying?" He shrugged, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "That you're not as untouchable as you think you are." I wasn't sure why those words made my heart skip. Maybe it was the way he said it, the way his eyes held mine for just a second too long before he looked away. Or maybe it was because, for the first time in weeks, I felt seen. Not as the humiliated wife, not as the woman scorned, just me. And that terrified me more than anything. I had already been fooled once. I had already let my guard down, let myself believe in something that wasn't real. Could I really trust another man? Even if that man was Jamie? Even if he had never given me a single reason to doubt him? I shoved the thought away, pushing myself back into reality. There was no room for distractions. I had a war to win. I had expected resistance. I knew he wouldn't let me go easily, but I hadn't expected this. The legal battle stretched for months, longer than I could have ever anticipated. My soon-to-be ex-husband fought ruthlessly, wielding every weapon at his disposal: money, influence, power, and, most frustratingly, lies. He bribed officials, dragged out hearings, fabricated false claims to make it seem as though I was the one being unreasonable. He made sure the process was as slow and painful as possible, a constant reminder that he still had control. At first, it infuriated me. Then it exhausted me. Every meeting, every document, every court date, it was a relentless, suffocating cycle. There were days when I thought about giving up, when I wondered if it was even worth it. But every time I felt myself slipping, Jamie was there. He was always there. At my side during meetings with my lawyers, making sure I never walked into a room alone, calling in favors, pulling strings, finding ways to counter every move my ex made. And when it got to be too much, when I was drowning in frustration and fatigue, he was the one who pulled me back up. "You didn't come this far just to let him win," he told me one night after yet another failed attempt to finalize the case. I let out a bitter laugh. "It feels like he's untouchable, like no matter what we do, he's always one step ahead." Jamie shook his head, his gaze steady. "He's not untouchable, he's just desperate, and desperate men make mistakes." He was right, and eventually, my ex did. The final hearing was brutal, his legal team fighting to stall the inevitable, trying every last trick they had. But the truth was stronger than his money, stronger than his lies. When the judge finally ruled in my favor, granting the divorce, I felt a weight lift off me that I hadn't even realized was there. It was over. I was free. The moment we stepped out of the courthouse, the cold air hitting my face, I turned to Jamie. He was watching me carefully, as if assessing whether I was about to break down or celebrate. Instead, I did something that surprised both of us. I threw my arms around him. He stiffened at first, probably shocked. I had never been one for casual affection. But then he relaxed, his arms wrapping around me in return. "Thank you," I whispered against his shoulder. I felt him exhale. "Anytime." We had been close before, but after that, something shifted. We weren't just boss and employee anymore. We weren't just allies. We were something more, not lovers, not yet, but closer than friends. I had trusted Jamie with my career, my business, my life, and now, for the first time, I trusted him with me. But my ex, he wasn't done. It happened late one evening, days after the finalization of the divorce. I had spent the entire day in meetings, trying to regain some sense of normalcy, trying to move forward. I was tired. I didn't hear them coming. I had just stepped out of my car, keys in hand, when I felt it. A presence. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Then, hands. Grabbing. Pulling. I barely had time to react before they forced me against the wall of the parking garage, rough fingers digging into my arms. "You should have just played nice," a low voice muttered near my ear. A wave of cold terror crashed through me. My ex. He sent them. I struggled, kicking, twisting, but they were stronger. One of them yanked my wrist, trying to restrain me. And then, suddenly, a blur of motion, a fist connecting with a jaw, a grunt of pain. And then Jamie was there. He moved fast, too fast for them to react. A sharp, precise strike sent one of the men sprawling to the ground. The other lunged at him, but Jamie was faster, dodging the attack with a calculated ease that I had never seen from him before. Another punch, another impact, and then silence. I was breathing hard, my back pressed against the wall, my entire body trembling as Jamie turned to me. His breathing was heavy, his fists still clenched, his sharp eyes scanning me for injuries. "Are you okay?" His voice was tight, controlled, but underneath there was something else, something furious. I nodded shakily. Yes, I think so." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "We need to get out of here." He was right. We had no idea if more of them were coming. Without another word, he grabbed my hand, leading me toward his car. His grip was firm, protective, as if letting go would mean losing me. We didn't speak until we were safely inside, the car speeding through the city streets. Then, finally, "You knew this could happen," I whispered. Jamie's jaw tightened. I had a feeling. I swallowed. "That's why you insisted on driving me tonight, isn't it?" His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Yes." I turned to look at him, studying his profile in the dim glow of the dashboard. "You never told me you could fight like that," I murmured. A small smirk touched his lips, though there was still tension in his posture. "You never asked." I let out a shaky breath, my body finally starting to process everything. "Jamie." His grip on the wheel loosened slightly. "Yeah?" I hesitated. There was so much I wanted to say, so much I should say. But in the end, I just whispered, "Thank you." He glanced at me, his gaze softer now. "Always." And for the first time in months, I felt safe. The city stretched before me, a sea of glittering lights against the dark night sky. I stood by the window, arms wrapped around myself, watching the world move on as if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't just spent the last few months fighting for my freedom. The divorce was finalized. I was free. So why did I feel so lost? Behind me, I heard Jamie moving around the kitchen, the familiar sound of tea being poured into a mug. It was his way of grounding me, always something warm, something steady. I had come to rely on that more than I ever thought I would. "You're thinking too much again." His voice pulled me from my thoughts. I turned, finding him leaning against the counter, watching me with that same steady patience he always had. I smiled faintly. I have a lot to think about. Jamie set down his mug, crossing his arms. "Like what?" I hesitated. How did I explain it? The emptiness that came after months of fighting? The way I had spent so long focused on winning that I hadn't stopped to ask myself what would happen after. I sighed, rubbing my temples. I guess I just thought I'd feel different. Jamie studied me for a moment before pushing off the counter, stepping closer. You are different, I scoffed. Am I? His gaze softened. Yeah, you are. I let out a quiet breath, shaking my head. I don't even know who I am anymore, Jamie. His brows furrowed slightly, and before I could stop him, he reached out, gently taking my hand. His touch was warm, grounding. You're the same person you've always been, he said quietly. The strongest, smartest, most stubborn woman I've ever met. I blinked up at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. Stubborn? He smirked. Painfully. I let out a small laugh, my fingers instinctively curling around his. This was what had kept me going. Not just the fight, not just the victory. Him. Jamie had been my constant, my safe place in the storm. And now, standing here, holding his hand, I realized something terrifying. I didn't want to lose him, not just as my friend, not just as my most trusted confidant, but as something more. I swallowed hard, trying to push the thought away. But Jamie was still watching me, his expression unreadable, like he was waiting for me to say something. I took a shaky breath. Jamie. His grip on my hand tightened slightly. Yeah? I hesitated. I could let this moment pass. I could pretend that nothing had changed, that I didn't feel the way my heart raced whenever he was close. But after everything, after all the pain, the lies, the heartbreak, I deserved to be honest. So I forced the words out. I don't know what I would have done without you. Jamie exhaled sharply, his thumb brushing against my knuckles. You would have been fine. You always are. I shook my head. No, Jamie, I needed you. His jaw clenched slightly, his eyes searching mine. I know. Silence stretched between us. And then, before I could lose my nerve, I whispered, I swallowed hard. I think I feel something for you. Jamie's expression shifted, something flickering in his eyes, something I had never allowed myself to see before. You think? He murmured, his voice lower now. I let out a soft laugh, shaking my head. No, I know. Jamie inhaled deeply, as if steadying himself. His hands slid up my arms, resting lightly on my shoulders. I've been waiting a long time to hear you say that, he admitted. My breath caught. You have? He nodded. But I didn't want to push you. I didn't want to be another man who... He paused, exhaling sharply. I needed you to choose me. Tears pricked my eyes. Jamie, He cupped my face gently, his thumbs brushing against my cheekbones. I love you. The words sent a shiver down my spine, not because I wasn't ready to hear them, but because, deep down, I already knew. I had known for weeks, maybe even months. I let out a shaky laugh, leaning into his touch. Say it again. Jamie smiled softly. I love you. A tear slipped down my cheek, but for the first time in a long time, it wasn't from pain. It was relief, happiness, freedom. I reached up, wrapping my arms around his neck, holding onto him like he was the only thing keeping me upright. I love you too. Jamie let out a breath, something between a laugh and a sigh of relief, before pulling me against him, holding me like he never wanted to let go. And for the first time in my life, I felt safe. I had fought so hard to escape the past. But now, for the first time, I wasn't just running away from something. I was running toward something, toward him, toward us. And for once, the future didn't feel so terrifying.